By the time the nurse returned with the clipboard, the doctor had already decided he would do nothing. The man on the exam table was in his 50s, a sharecropper with hands like split bark, and he kept trying to sit up because he thought sitting up was how you showed respect. The room smelled of alcohol swabs and chalky soap. A government seal hung on the wall, and that seal, more than the stethoscope, was what made him believe he was safe. Bad blood, they had told him. Bad blood was why he felt tired, why his joints burned, why his vision sometimes blurred at dusk. Bad blood was a sickness you could talk about without shame. It was also a phrase that could mean almost anything, which made it perfect for people who did not want to say the real word. Syphilis. On paper, the visit looked like care, a physical, a blood draw, a note in a file, a promise that treatment was coming. In practice, it was inventory. They measured him the way you measure a storm you do not intend to stop. He did not know that a cure existed. He did not know that doctors elsewhere were already using a drug that could erase the infection from his body. He did not know that men like him were being kept untreated on purpose, because the point was not to heal, but to watch what happened when no one healed you. If he had known, what would he have done? Walked out, demanded penicillin, reported them. The cruel trick of Tuskegee was that it took place in a world where none of those were realistic options. The experiment depended on poverty, on segregation, on the distance between the language of medicine and the lived reality of black men in rural Alabama. The nurse smiled and said the same words she always said. She called him Mr. She reminded him about the free ride home, about the hot meal afterward, about the burial insurance that would keep his family from passing a hat at church. These details were not kindness. They were the glue that held the study together. The doctor asked a few questions, listened to his chest, wrote down symptoms that had already been predicted years earlier. Then he closed the folder, as if closing it could keep the future sealed inside. The ethical question was never asked out loud in that room, but it was there anyway. When does a human being stop being a patient and become a specimen? When does a government decide that a life is more useful as data than as a person? The Tuskegee Syphilis Study did not begin with a single monstrous act. It began with a choice that was easy to disguise: to delay treatment for now, to keep watching a little longer, to believe that knowledge would someday justify what was being withheld today. And once that first delay was normalized, the next one came easier. Months became years. Years became decades. Outside the clinic walls, the country transformed. The Great Depression gave way to war. Soldiers went overseas. Factories roared. Presidents changed. Medical textbooks were rewritten. Somewhere in that rush of modern progress, penicillin turned syphilis from a slow sentence into a curable infection. Inside the study, the men kept coming back. They came because the government told them to, because the nurse wrote their names on appointment cards, because no one else offered a doctor at all, because trusting authority was sometimes the only way to survive, and because they did not know the most important fact. The care they were promised was a performance, and the cure was being kept out of reach. The moment you understand that, the study stops being a scandal from another era and becomes a warning about any institution with the power to define what counts as good science. To see how 40 years of non-treatment could be justified, funded, and defended, you have to go back before the first blood draw, to the South in 1932, to the mythology of race in medicine, and to a public health system hungry for prestige at any cost. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study did not emerge from cruelty alone. It emerged from a system that believed itself rational, progressive, and justified. In 1932, the United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. Unemployment was widespread, hunger common, and access to medical care sharply divided along lines of class and race. In the rural South, especially in counties like Macon County, Alabama, poverty was structural and persistent. Most black residents were sharecroppers, bound to land they did not own, earning barely enough to survive. Doctors were scarce. Hospitals were segregated. For many families, professional medical care was something they encountered only at birth or death. Disease filled the gaps left by neglect. Tuberculosis, malaria, and syphilis were endemic. Syphilis in particular was widespread and poorly treated. Before the antibiotic era, therapy was expensive, dangerous, and inconsistent. For public health officials, it represented both a crisis and an opportunity. At the federal level, the U.S. Public Health Service was looking to expand its research authority. The agency had grown in scope during the early 20th century and was eager to establish itself as a scientific leader, not merely a regulatory body. Large-scale studies offered prestige, publications, and influence. Syphilis seemed like an ideal subject. It was chronic, it progressed slowly, and crucially, it was already widespread among populations with little political power. Embedded within American medicine at the time was the belief that race was biologically meaningful, that black bodies behaved differently, aged differently, and responded differently to disease. These assumptions were not fringe views. They were taught in medical schools and printed in journals. One of the prevailing ideas was that syphilis manifested more benignly in black men, progressing differently than in white patients. This claim was never supported by rigorous evidence, but it was widely accepted. The Tuskegee study was framed as a way to finally document the natural course of the disease in a specific population. Initially, the plan was limited. The study was designed to last between 6 and 8 months. Men would be examined, observed, and then treated using the standard therapies of the time. Funding was modest. The scale was manageable. From an administrative perspective, it looked unremarkable. To gain access to the local population, federal officials partnered with the Tuskegee Institute, a respected black educational institution. Its involvement lent legitimacy and reassured potential participants. If Tuskegee was involved, the study felt trustworthy. Recruitment followed a familiar pattern. Notices were sent. Community leaders were contacted. Men were invited to participate in what was described as a government health program. 600 black men were enrolled. Roughly 400 had syphilis. 200 did not, and served as a comparison group. None were told which group they were in. None were told they had syphilis. Instead, they were told they had bad blood, a term commonly used in the region to describe a range of ailments. The phrase carried no specific prognosis and no clear stigma. It allowed doctors to discuss symptoms without revealing diagnoses, and it discouraged questions that might disrupt compliance. The incentives mattered. Participants received free medical examinations, transportation to and from clinics, meals on examination days, and burial insurance, an especially powerful promise in a community where funerals could financially devastate families. To men who had never received consistent medical attention, this felt like care. It felt like inclusion. At no point were they asked for informed consent. There was no explanation of risks, no disclosure of alternatives, no discussion of what would happen if they withdrew. At the time, this absence did not violate any specific law. Ethics in medical research were governed largely by professional discretion, not participant rights. As the study progressed, something shifted. Researchers realized they had assembled a compliant, stable cohort, one that returned regularly, trusted the staff, and asked few questions. Ending the study after a few months would mean losing a rare opportunity for long-term observation. Quietly, without public announcement or participant notification, the timeline was extended. Then medicine changed in a way that made the decision irreversible. By the mid-1940s, penicillin emerged as a safe, effective cure for syphilis. What had once been a chronic, debilitating disease became routinely treatable. Public health campaigns expanded. Doctors across the country embraced the new standard of care. For the men in Tuskegee, the breakthrough changed nothing. Providing treatment would have ended the study. Ending the study would have meant admitting that its premise, that untreated syphilis needed to be observed, was no longer defensible. Instead of adapting, the study hardened. Withholding treatment became policy. From that point forward, the Tuskegee study was no longer simply observing disease. It was actively preventing care. What was at stake was no longer just data, but institutional credibility. Careers had been built on the study. Papers had been published. Acknowledging harm would mean acknowledging failure. So the study continued, supported by bureaucracy, rationalization, and silence. The men, unaware of the scientific debates surrounding them, kept showing up, and with every visit, the cost of stopping grew higher. What made the Tuskegee Syphilis Study endure was not dramatic cruelty, but routine. The men were summoned periodically, often once or twice a year. Letters arrived with official letterhead. Sometimes a nurse appeared in person to remind them of appointments. Transportation was arranged. The process was efficient, predictable, and reassuring. For participants, this regularity signaled legitimacy. Governments did not usually lie in such organized ways. Inside the clinics, the rituals of medicine unfolded as expected. Blood was drawn. Spinal taps were performed and described as special free treatments, even though they were diagnostic procedures designed to measure neurological damage. Charts were updated. Symptoms were logged. The men were thanked for their cooperation and sent home with small comforts that reinforced trust. Nothing about these encounters suggested danger. That was the point. Language played a crucial role. Doctors and nurses avoided precise terms. Bad blood remained the central explanation, elastic enough to cover every symptom without ever pointing toward a curable infection. When men asked whether they would get better, they were told they were being closely monitored, that the government was taking care of them. Care in this context meant observation. As the years passed, the physical decline of the participants became impossible to ignore. Syphilis followed its known trajectory. In some men, the disease attacked the nervous system, leading to confusion, memory loss, tremors, and paralysis. In others, it damaged the heart and blood vessels, increasing the risk of stroke and sudden death. These outcomes were not surprises to the researchers. They were, in fact, the data they sought. Each complication was recorded with clinical interest. When penicillin became widely available after World War II, the ethical stakes changed dramatically. This was no longer a case of observing an untreatable illness. The cure was inexpensive, effective, and increasingly standard. For most Americans, a syphilis diagnosis no longer carried a decades-long sentence. For the men in Tuskegee, access to that cure was actively blocked. Internal correspondence made the policy explicit. Study administrators instructed staff to ensure that participants did not receive treatment from other sources. When men were drafted during World War II and diagnosed with syphilis during military physicals, researchers intervened to have them exempted from service, specifically so they would not be treated. The justification was framed in neutral bureaucratic terms. Treatment would compromise the integrity of the study. Intervention would invalidate long-term observations. These phrases transformed suffering into a technical inconvenience. Over time, the study became self-perpetuating. Younger doctors inherited it as a professional responsibility. They did not design the original protocol, but they enforced it. Files were passed down, procedures repeated. The absence of a single villain made the system harder to confront. Crucially, the study was not hidden from the medical community. Articles describing its findings appeared in respected journals. Conferences referenced it. The men were anonymized, reduced to statistics and case numbers. Their voices never appeared in print. Outside the study, the world was changing. The revelations of Nazi medical crimes during the Nuremberg trials shocked the global conscience. The Nuremberg Code established principles that emphasized voluntary consent and the right to withdraw from experiments. Internationally, medical ethics entered a new phase. Inside Tuskegee, nothing changed. The contradiction was stark. American physicians condemned atrocities abroad while defending non-treatment at home. The difference, unspoken but decisive, was race and power. The men in Macon County were not seen as autonomous individuals capable of consent or refusal. They were seen as a population to be managed. Some staff members began to feel unease. Nurses witnessed men deteriorate over years. They attended funerals. They comforted widows. Yet the structure of the study left no clear path for dissent. Concerns were absorbed, deflected, or reframed as misunderstandings. The men themselves adapted in quieter ways. Some stopped asking questions. Others interpreted worsening symptoms as fate or God's will. The authority of the clinic, reinforced by uniforms and official language, remained intact. Families were drawn into the consequences. Wives were unknowingly infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis, suffering blindness, deformities, and developmental delays. These outcomes too were documented, secondary data points in a study that had long since escaped its original justification. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Tuskegee study had lost any plausible scientific rationale. The natural history of syphilis was well documented elsewhere. Penicillin's effectiveness was beyond dispute. What remained was inertia. Ending the study would require admitting that men had been harmed deliberately. Continuing it required only silence. Institutions tend to choose silence. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, the study persisted in the background, largely invisible to the public. Its participants aged. Many were now elderly, ill, or disabled. The opportunity to prevent harm had passed, replaced by the question of accountability. The study no longer existed to answer a medical question. It existed because stopping it would force the system to confront what it had done. The beginning of the end did not come from outrage or reform. It came from discomfort. In 1966, a young social worker and public health service employee named Peter Buxton encountered information about the Tuskegee Syphilis Study while reviewing internal materials. At first, he assumed he had misunderstood. The idea that the federal government was deliberately withholding treatment for a curable disease seemed incompatible with everything he had been taught about medical ethics. So he asked questions. What he received were polite, bureaucratic answers. The study was long-standing. It had produced valuable data. The participants were being observed, not harmed. Treatment, he was told, would interfere with the scientific objectives. Buxton was advised, gently but firmly, to let the matter go. He did not. Over the next several years, Buxton raised repeated objections through internal channels. He wrote memos. He requested reviews. He asked whether the study could possibly be justified, now that penicillin was universally recognized as the standard of care. Each time, the response was the same. The study was ongoing, approved, and not his responsibility to question. This pattern was revealing. The Tuskegee study no longer needed defenders who believed in it. It needed only administrators who would not challenge it. Ethical responsibility had been fragmented into harmless-looking tasks: file maintenance, appointment scheduling, data analysis. No one person felt powerful enough or obligated enough to stop it. By the late 1960s, the study had become an institutional ghost. It was rarely discussed openly, but it continued automatically. Annual reports were filed. Funding was renewed. The men were still summoned. Inside Macon County, the effects were visible. Participants who had once been middle-aged were now elderly. Some were blind. Some suffered severe neurological impairment. Others had died quietly, their cause of death recorded in clinical language that obscured the role of deliberate non-treatment. Families had adapted to loss without explanation. Wives who developed syphilis believed they had done something wrong. Children born with congenital infections were treated as tragic anomalies, not preventable outcomes. No one connected their suffering to a study they had never been told existed. By this point, the moral failure was no longer abstract, it was cumulative. In 1972, after years of internal resistance had failed, Buxton made a decision that would end the study. He took his concerns outside the system. He contacted a reporter. When the story broke in the national press, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Headlines described government doctors watching black men die from a curable disease. Editorials demanded accountability. Civil rights leaders condemned the study as racist and criminal. The public, many encountering the story for the first time, struggled to comprehend how it could have continued for 40 years. The institutions involved moved quickly, not to defend the study but to contain the damage. Within months, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was officially terminated. No gradual phase-out, no careful transition. The experiment ended abruptly, not because its goals had been met, but because it could no longer survive exposure. For the men, the end came too late. Survivors were informed, some by letter, others in person, that they had been part of an experiment and had not received treatment for syphilis. Many did not understand what that meant. Some refused to believe it. Others reacted with anger, confusion, or numbness. Years of trust collapsed in a single conversation. Medical care was finally offered. Penicillin was administered, but for many the damage was irreversible. Neurological impairment could not be undone. Lost vision did not return. The drug could halt progression, but it could not restore what had already been taken. Congress launched formal investigations. Hearings were held. Officials testified. The study was dissected in public, its rationalizations exposed as hollow. No one disputed the facts. The only disagreement was over responsibility. A class action lawsuit followed. In 1974, The government agreed to a settlement that included financial compensation for survivors and their families, as well as lifetime medical care. The amounts, while significant on paper, could not account for decades of suffering, loss of income, or broken trust. More important than the settlement was the reckoning that followed. The Tuskegee study became a turning point in American medical ethics. It directly influenced the creation of institutional review boards, the codification of informed consent, and new federal regulations governing research on human subjects. What had once been left to professional discretion was now subject to oversight. The study's collapse also forced a broader conversation about race and medicine. Tuskegee was not an anomaly. It was an extreme expression of assumptions that had long shaped healthcare in the United States. Assumptions about who deserved care, whose pain mattered, and whose bodies could be used in the name of progress. The exposure of the study did not simply end an experiment. It ended the illusion that science, left to its own devices, would always correct itself. The men of Tuskegee had been studied for 40 years. When the study ended, the country began studying itself, asking how such a failure had been possible and what it revealed about power, prejudice, and the cost of silence. The experiment collapsed, not because it lacked data, but because it finally lost legitimacy. And once legitimacy was gone, there was nothing left to justify the damage that had already been done. When the Tuskegee Syphilis Study officially ended in 1972, it did not truly conclude. It lingered, first as scandal, then as symbol, and finally as a permanent scar on the relationship between medicine and the people it claimed to serve. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was procedural. Laws were rewritten, oversight structures were built, institutional review boards became mandatory. Informed consent was no longer an ethical courtesy, but a legal requirement. On paper, the system corrected itself. But Tuskegee was never only a failure of procedure. It was a failure of moral imagination. For decades, researchers were able to look at suffering and interpret it as data. They translated pain into charts, decline into graphs, death into conclusions. This was possible because the men were never fully seen as equals, never granted the same moral urgency as patients who looked different, lived elsewhere, or held more power. The long-term consequences were profound. Among Black Americans, Tuskegee became shorthand for betrayal. It entered oral history, community memory, and cultural consciousness as proof that the medical system could not be trusted. This distrust was not irrational. It was inherited. Even generations later, the shadow of Tuskegee influenced decisions about vaccinations, clinical trials, and hospital care. Public health officials struggled to understand why skepticism persisted. Tuskegee was part of the answer. In 1997, 65 years after the study began, Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. Survivors and their families were invited to the White House. The words were carefully chosen, solemn, overdue. The apology acknowledged wrongdoing. It named racism. It recognized suffering. It did not restore lost years, repair damaged bodies, or undo buried grief. But it marked a rare moment when an institution publicly admitted that science, when detached from ethics, can become cruelty disguised as progress. Tuskegee now occupies a central place in medical ethics education. Students study it as a warning. Researchers cite it as a boundary that must never be crossed again. Regulations point back to it as justification. Yet the most important lesson of Tuskegee is not about consent forms or review boards. It is about normalization. The study did not survive for 40 years because everyone involved was malicious. It survived because harm became routine, because delaying treatment felt minor when compared to greater knowledge, because responsibility was fragmented until no one felt accountable. Tuskegee teaches that ethical collapse rarely arrives with drama. It arrives quietly, disguised as protocol buried in language sustained by silence. The men who participated did not see themselves as heroes or victims. They believed they were receiving care. They trusted uniforms, institutions, and promises. That trust was exploited with devastating efficiency. Their story endures because it asks an uncomfortable question, one that cannot be confined to history. Who is most at risk when science decides that ends justify means? As new technologies emerge, genetic editing, neural interfaces, data-driven medicine, The temptation to prioritize knowledge over consent returns in new forms. Tuskegee reminds us that safeguards are only as strong as the values behind them. The study is over. The consequences are not. The final legacy of Tuskegee is not just a cautionary tale about the past, but a demand placed on the present, to recognize that ethical vigilance is not automatic, that progress is not neutral, and that the people most likely to be sacrificed in the name of science are often those with the least power to refuse. The experiment ended when it was exposed. The responsibility to remember it and to act differently does not end at all.